So Gothic fiction, which is also known as Gothic horror, is a loose literary aesthetic of fear and haunting. The name is a reference to Gothic architecture of the European Middle Ages, which was the characteristic settings of the early Gothic novels. The first work to call itself Gothic was Horace Walpole's 1764 novel, The Castle of Otranto, later subtitled A Gothic Story. Subsequent 18th century contributors included Clara Reeve, Anne Radcliffe, William Thomas Beckford, and Matthew Lewis. The Gothic influence continued into the 19th century works in the Romantic poets as well. Novelists like Mary Shelley, Walter Scott, Hoffman frequently drew upon Gothic motifs in their works. The early Victorian period continued the use of Gothic in novels by Charles Dickens, Bronte sisters, or even American writers like Edgar Allan Poe and Nathaniel Hawthorne. Later, modern novelists like Bram Stoker in his Dracula, or Richard Marsh's Beetle, or Robert Stevenson's, Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. All of these have a very, very Gothic fixation and temperament in their writing. Now, what is this Gothic fiction, Gothic literature? As we said, its origin is the European Middle Ages, where there was the renaissance of the Gothic architecture. Now, this architecture were large, dark buildings and dungeons and castles, which were storehouses of lots of spinning yarns related to the supernatural, to the ghostly, to the horrific. So that is where this inspiration was drawn on. So the Gothic fiction is characterized by an environment of fear, the threat of supernatural events, and the intrusion of the past upon the present. It is distinguished from other forms of scary and supernatural stories, such as the fairy tale, because of the specific theme of being haunted by the past. Fairy tales do also have supernatural, but they are not haunting stories. They don't have that scary element. That is something that the Gothic literature had. The setting typically includes physical reminders of the past, especially through ruined buildings, which stand as proof of a previously thriving world, which is decaying in the present. Especially in the 18th and 19th centuries, characteristic settings include castles, religious buildings like monasteries, convents, etc. The atmosphere is typically claustrophobic because the people are stuck in that place. They can't move out. They need some help, some divine intervention to be saved from the horrific. And the common plot elements include vengeful persecution, imprisonment, and murder. The depiction of horrible events in Gothic fiction often serves as a metaphorical expression of psychological or social conflicts. The Gothic literature is intimately, The Gothic literature is intimately associated with the Gothic revival architecture of the same era. The English Gothic writers often associated medieval buildings with what they saw as a dark and terrifying period, marked by a harsh law enforced by torture, mysterious, fantastic, superstitious rituals. Similar to Gothic revivalists' rejection of the clarity and rationalism of the neoclassical style of the enlightened establishment, the literary Gothic embodies an appreciation of the joys of extreme emotion, the thrills of fearfulness, and awe inherent in the sublime, and a quest for atmosphere of the horror. Gothic ruins invoke multiple linked emotions by representing inevitable decay and collapse of human creations. Hence, the urge to add fake ruins as eye-catchers in English landscape parks. So, placing a story in a Gothic building serves several purposes. It inspires awe, implies that the story is set in the past, gives an impression of isolation or dissociation from the rest of the world, and conveys religious associations as well. Setting this novel in a Gothic castle was meant to imply a story not only set in the past, but also shrouded in darkness. The architecture often served as a mirror for the characters and events of the story. The buildings in the Castle of Otranto, for example, are riddled with tunnels that characters use to move back and forth in secret. This movement mirrors the secrets surrounding Manfred's possession of the castle and how it came into his family. The Gothic literature was popular, and with popularity, it also belonged to the time when literacy was widespread. People of all strata, including women, were learning to read and write. And this was also the time where, therefore, when the female writers became torchbearers of this genre. We have Mrs. Anne Radcliffe, we have Charlotte Brontë and Mary Shelley, all of these writers, women writers especially, who took to this genre of literature and wrote extensively. So these female writers, now from the castles, dungeons, forests, and hidden passages of the Gothic novel emerged the female Gothic. There is a proper genre that is dedicated to the female writers of this genre. They're known as the female Gothic. So guided by the works of authors like Anne Radcliffe, Jane Austen, Mary Shelley, and Charlotte Brontë, the female Gothic allowed women's societal and sexual desires to be introduced through these literature. In many respects, the novel's intended reader of the time was a woman who, even as she enjoyed such novels, felt she had to lay down her books with affected indifference or momentary shame. According to Jane Austen, author of Northanger Abbey, the Gothic novel shaped its form for women readers to turn to Gothic romances to find support for their own mixed feelings, where the women could not express themselves properly. If they enjoyed literature like the Gothic, they had to hide it from the society, from the people, as we see in Northanger Abbey, how, in fact, Northanger Abbey actually makes fun of the Gothic literature and calls them a horrid list of Gothic literature, because the women to be taking pleasure in something so horrific was absolutely shocking to accept. The female Gothic narratives focus on such topics as a persecuted heroine in flight from a villainous father and in search of an absent mother, while male writers tend towards the masculine transgression of social taboos. The emergence of the ghost story gave women writers something to write about besides the common marriage plot, allowing them to present a more radical critique of male power, violence, and predatory sexuality. Female Gothic novels also address women's discontent with patriarchal society, their problematic and unsatisfying maternal position, and their role within that society. Mostly, it had a typical plot line that of a damsel in distress stuck in an old castle and the horrors that she would witness over there, and then the knight in shining armor would come and save her. The Gothic elements witnessed before Walpole and his times in the works of Shakespeare, Milton, and even Alexander Pope. So Horace Walpole, though, is credited with writing one of the first Gothic novels as The Castle of Otranto, he wasn't literally the first to implement Gothic elements in his work. We witness it even before him. The plays of Shakespeare, in particular, were a crucial reference point for early Gothic writers, in both an effort to bring credibility to their works as well as legitimize the emergence of literature to the public. Tragedies such as Hamlet, Macbeth, King Lear, Romeo and Juliet, Richard III, with plots revolving around the supernatural, revenge, murder, ghosts, witchcraft, omens, written in dramatic pathos, all of them set in medieval castles, was a huge influence upon early Gothic writers. And they extensively make allusions to Shakespeare's works. In fact, John Milton's Paradise Lost was also very influential among Gothic writers, who were especially drawn to the tragic anti-hero character that was Satan, and became a model for many charismatic Gothic villains and Byronic heroes. Milton's version of the myth of the fall and redemption, creation and decreation, as Frankenstein again reveals, is an important model for Gothic plots. Alexander Pope, who had a considerable influence over Walpole, because remember, they belonged to the same club, the same society, the Scribblers Club. It was the first significant poet of the 18th century who wrote a poem in an authentic Gothic manner, Eloisa to Abelard, which tells of star-crossed lovers, one doomed to a life of seclusion in a convent and the other in a monastery, abounds in gloomy imagery, religious terror, and suppressed passion. The influence of Pope's poem is found throughout 18th century Gothic literature, including the novels of Walpole and Radcliffe. And however, the first work to call itself Gothic was definitely Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto. And its first edition presented the story as a translation of a 16th century manuscript, and it became widely popular. And then there was a second edition in which Horace Walpole added the subtitle of a horror story or a Gothic story, which was also criticized to some extent because they considered it inappropriate for a modern author of the scientific age to write a supernatural story in such a rational age. However, Walpole did not initially prompt many imitators. It was later with Clara Reeve, who wrote the Old English Baron in 1778, and that the popularity grew. And then the 1780s saw more writers attempting his combination of supernatural plots with emotionally realistic characters. Some examples include Sophia Lee's The Recess or William Beckford's Vathek, where we have the first instance of something like Wolverine. And then at the height of Gothic novels' popularity in 1790s, the genre was almost synonymous with Anne Radcliffe, whose works were highly anticipated and widely imitated. Particularly popular were The Romance of the Forest, which released in 1791, and The Mysteries of Udolpho, which released in 1794. Other notable Gothic novels in 1790s include William Godwin's Caleb Williams, Regina Maria Roche's Clermont, Charles Brogden Brown's Violent, and there were various other short stories and novels that were published anonymously by the Minerva Press. However, the excess of the Gothic element also led to the treatment of the Gothic as an absurd literature. The excesses, the stereotypes, and the frequent absurdities of the Gothic genre made it rich territory for satire as well. And we have Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who mentioned how tired he had become with the terrible in literature. And after 1800, there was a period in which Gothic parodies outnumbered sincere Gothic novels. And the heroine by Eton Stannard Barrett or the Gothic types are exaggerated for comic effect in works like Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey. As I said, that there is the reference to the horrid Gothic literature in there, and how people are taking guilty pleasure in reading Gothic literature because they know that it's all just a farce. And in Northanger Abbey, we see the naive protagonist, much like a female Quixote, who conceives herself as a heroine of a Radcliffean romance, imagines murder and villainy on every side, though the truth turns out to be much more prosaic. So that is how it is made fun of. And educators in literary, cultural, and architectural studies, however, appreciate the Gothic because they say that by presenting the Gothic as something that facilitated thinking into the supernatural realm, they actually promoted more of scientific investigation. That is the promotion of the other. If I'm sure you must be aware of the binary opposites. When you talk of one, you actually are adhering to the one that you're not talking about. So by talking so much and so extensively about the terrible and the disastrous, the horrific, the supernatural, ghosts and everything, it was actually scientific rationality that was promoted because people began to question. And therefore, this question of rationality and fact-based ideas came back with a vehemence post this genre's popularity.